South Park and Robot Chicken are probably two of the most famous animated shows aimed exclusively at adults out there. And due to their extremely R-rated and controversial styles of humor, they have both also been on the receiving end of a ton of backlash and controversy from the general public. But when the creators of both those shows decided it was time they do a movie, the results were decidedly different. Because on the one hand, South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut was considered a rather big deal when it came out, and, even though it of course did generate some controversy, received so much acclaim that it even got an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song. While the writers of Robot Chicken, however, helped write a movie separate from their TV show called Hell and Back, which quickly fell into obscurity and received mostly negative reviews from critics, some of whom were even rather upset about some rather insensitive jokes about sensitive topics. And today, I'd like to try and explain what the creators of South Park did right in their movie adaptation that the writers of Robot Chicken did wrong with their movie. And there are going to be spoilers for both movies ahead, so if you haven't seen either of them but want to, you should click off the video now. This will be your only warning. Now, to start off simply, just because something is crass or gross out in nature doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. And the reason I bring this up is because South Park honestly has a knack for getting its point across in the most controversial, over-the-top ways possible. Which is what some people love about the show and what other people hate about it. But the point is, while the show can sometimes be controversial and rather gratuitous for no good reason, most of the time they're doing it to try and impart some lesson worth teaching onto the audience. And the funny thing is, you can actually find some rather wholesome lessons to be had for such a crass show. That's not always the case, don't get me wrong, but I think most can agree that's when South Park is at its best. Now, Robot Chicken, meanwhile, is built much more on being a deconstructive, adult parody of pop culture, which is why its most famous sketches usually revolve around the ones that take innocent children's movies, shows, or concepts and take them to really dark places. So unlike South Park, which at least tries to impart a lesson in all of its adult humor, Robot Chicken is much more about trying to tell the most edgy, adult jokes possible just to deconstruct something. And while the results can be pretty funny, don't get me wrong, the point is that the show doesn't really have much to say, beyond that sometimes what you see in the movies isn't what you'd actually get in real life. And that's where we get to the two movies I brought up earlier. Because you see, these two movies reflect the styles of the people who wrote them perfectly. As I went on at much greater length in my video on movie adaptations of TV shows, which you can find a link in the description to, South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut is pretty much just a feature-length episode of the TV series. But what really makes it work is that it also contains all of the best aspects of the show. Now once again, maybe the humor and jokes can be a bit too much for some people, but at the end of the day, this movie actually does have morals to impart on the audience. In this movie, Matt Stone and Trey Parker brilliantly use satire to get their points across, and in the end are saying stuff worth saying with it. Which is why, even for all of its crass and explicit humor, it still ended up as acclaimed as it was. And sure, some of the time they were clearly just using their signature brand of humor just for the heck of it. But that doesn't change the fact that on the whole, there was very much a method to their madness. However, Hell and Back has no such underlying meaningfulness to it. This movie is simply about how many sex jokes the writers can fit into a given time slot, and no thought is really given to it beyond that. Even the writer's attempts at playing on ancient myths ends up falling completely flat because all they're interested in is adding as much inappropriate humor to it as possible. As I pretty much just said, the movie really ends up being nothing more than just one big sex joke that's deliberately trying to be controversial for no other reason than because it can. For example, it is extremely obvious they're trying to get under the skin of religious people, with a perfect instance of that being the explanation that the devil was kicked out of heaven because he tried to have sex with God's girlfriend. Yeah, that's the kind of movie this is. To put it simply, the movie can be best described as a Seth Rogen type movie, but not funny. And that's the thing here. The movie doesn't have to be deep or impart some life-changing lesson. If all it wants to be is funny, that's absolutely fine. The only problem is that it isn't funny. The concept, the jokes, they just don't work. Even an immature teenager wouldn't find them amusing. I mean, I'm not saying there isn't a single joke in the movie that doesn't land. I'm sure there's something that works. But the point is that the movie doesn't have anything to say, and it isn't even funny on top of that. So in the end, as I said before, it doesn't really have anything to offer besides a ton of unamusing sex jokes. And that's another advantage South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut has over Hell and Back. It's actually funny. It may be in a very sick and twisted way, yes, but as long as the audience is willing to accept that, then the point still remains that it is actually funny. And when you combine that with the fact that it does have valuable lessons to teach the audience that it gets across pretty effectively in its own over-the-top way, it really does make for a surprisingly well-written movie all around. And in that is where I believe South Park is able to stand out over most other shows like it. Because again, you can love or hate them, but Matt Stone and Trey Parker are geniuses when it comes to satire. Sure, they love to be edgy and controversial, but they still also have messages they want to convey to the audience, and boy are they not afraid to get them across. And while some may question their methods, the point still remains that they usually do end up getting their morals across more often than not, and are actually pretty good at eliciting laughs to boot. Because if you look at it, their movie Team America World Police employs all of the same methods that both South Park and its movie did. And not only does it make for a rather funny and effective satire, but gets across a pretty important message to boot. To put it simply, Stone and Parker are really good at what they do, which is what helps make their material so good even with their style of humor and the controversial elements that come with it. When it comes to the writers of Robot Chicken, however, it's a completely different story. Because, and not to take away anything from the show here, as it's still pretty clever and funny, but it's rather easy to just deconstruct things. It's easy to take a look at something and either explain what's wrong with it or think of a way to make it really dark. Honestly, with the never-ending ocean that is pop culture, the toughest part for them is really in how they make their ideas funny. And even then, based off the way the show works, it can't be that difficult. Challenging, sure, but definitely not the hardest form of comedy in the world. So the point is, when it was time to write Hell and Back, a standalone movie with a completely different format from the show, well, let's just say the results speak for themselves. But again, that doesn't mean it still couldn't have at least been funny. If the writers had just dedicated more time to actually putting thought into their material rather than how many religious controversies and sex jokes they could fit into 80 minutes, then maybe it would have turned out better. Alright, so the point here is, the reason the creators of South Park fared much better when writing a movie than the writers of Robot Chicken is because they know how to write satire. Their jokes not only serve a purpose, at least some of the time anyway, but they know how to present them so that the audience will laugh at them. But because the concept behind Hell and Back was completely different from what the writers of Robot Chicken were used to, the movie just ended up an unfunny mess that was almost immediately forgotten. And most would agree that was definitely for the best. Though I'm not saying the writers in question aren't untalented, just that they were out of their element and focusing on the wrong things. But I still think most would agree that if you're going to go crass, edgy, and controversial in the first place, then it has to take after shows like South Park and actually be funny, and at least try to impart some kind of lesson in order to justify it being that way. Alright, that's everything I've got on that. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut is considered better than most movies of its nature despite its style of humor because it actually makes for an effective satire? Or do you believe it's just as bad as Hell and Back and that I have no idea what I'm talking about? Please let me know in the comments below. And like I just said, you don't have to agree with this video. You can absolutely hate South Park and everything its creators have done if you so wish, and nobody can tell you you're wrong. I was more just trying to explain the general consensus behind these movies more than anything else. And thank you all for watching. It's all greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.